Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. Sir Henry continues his autobiographical journey on January 18, 1977, when the Fraser family arrived in Jamaica. He describes the socio-political environment of that period.
I have to tell you that the return to Jamaica in 1977 was exactly 2 months after the second Michael Manley election victory. Now, Michael Manley had made himself extremely unpopular with the Americans, led by Ronald Reagan, the conservative member of the Republican Party, who was president at the time. Michael Manley had become friendly with the president of Mozambique, who was a very radical politician, and he'd become very friendly with Fidel Castro. And he had introduced what he called democratic socialism. Well, the Americans didn't like the adjective democratic. They simply regarded him as a socialist and as a threat to American hegemony. And his friendship with Castro was the absolute end as far as the Americans were concerned. So it was widely alleged that there were people in Jamaica, CIA people, busy undermining the Manley administration. It was said that the Americans were out to destabilize Jamaica and remove Michael Manley. And it was also said that because of the political problems that Michael Manley had witnessed 60,000 Jamaicans applying for green cards in the year 1976. And Michael Manley was famous for having allegedly said, "There are 5 flights to Miami. Whoever wants to go, go." And the response that we heard when we went back to Jamaica was that it was being said, "Last person out of Jamaica, remember to turn off the lights." So Jamaica was a very difficult place to live in at that time. The supermarkets were empty. People fought to buy rice, which was a staple in Jamaica. I remember that the frozen and cold section of the supermarkets that we went to, 2 supermarkets on either side of the road. You could go here and look for something, it wasn't there, you went to the other side of the road. And all of the cold sections, which was mostly imported food, completely empty because the foreign exchange just wasn't there. So you lived on very, very, very basic food. Most of the time you could get chicken, you couldn't always get rice, you could sometimes get potatoes, and you would go to the market at Papine and you would buy your akis and you could eat, as you know, in that way, fairly cheaply, but you didn't have much choice. And then we went to work in the hospital. Maureen didn't have a decent job. She had to return to a junior job in dermatology. I'd had a job created for me because I was, you know, PhD specialist and all of that. So I went back to that job and I enjoyed that setting, but Maureen was doing the same scut work that she had done as a junior doctor 4 years before, and that was untenable. But living in Jamaica was very difficult. There were helicopters overhead. Cars were being stopped and examined for drugs and guns and things like that all the time. We were stopped a couple of times. Helicopters overhead looking for the criminals. Everybody had 5 locks on the door and 2 Dobermans in the yard. You know, it was a very difficult social environment. The professional environment was also difficult because the hospital was lacking in facilities, in equipment, in the basic tools that you needed to practice medicine. And because of the impact of the economy, there were more sick people who couldn't get the drugs they needed. So people came in extremis. So during that period, there were many, many challenges. But what was interesting for me was that I was now going back to the hospital where I had been a medical student, where I had been a middle grade doctor with somebody giving advice, teaching and so on. I was now the person where the buck stopped. I was the person who had to make the big decisions. I was the person who was now the consultant with a team, teaching the medical students, doing all that stuff, getting involved in research too, because we had one of the big dengue outbreaks. We'd had a dengue outbreak in 1969 across the Caribbean. And the next big one was that year of 1977. And so we were admitting patients with severe dengue and the dengue complications. You've heard of dengue hemorrhagic shock, for example, which killed the son of one of our doctors. And I was therefore at the center of this dengue outbreak. And my colleague, Dr. Wilson, and I worked on this, studied these patients, evaluated them, treated them, and wrote them up. So 2 papers 2 medical publications came out of that period in Jamaica, and I learned really how to function in the environment that I knew best as a consultant, where, as I said, the buck stops. But we were not happy with this situation. And at the first Department of Medicine meeting, Professor Aline, now Sir George Aline, PAHO Emeritus Director, Sir George announced that the job in medicine, which had been created just 6 months earlier and had been taken by my young friend, Dr. Trevor Atherley, as a cardiology job, he had discovered that the hospital had promised the development of cardiac equipment. Now, he was a highly trained invasive cardiologist, so he was coming back to Barbados both to teach and to upgrade our cardiology skills for patients. And so he had been promised that by the time he took up the job, the equipment would all be there for him to practice. Well, he came, but the promise, as is so often the case, the promise was not kept. And he discovered in his 3 months in the job that there was no likelihood of it being kept in the immediate future. So at Christmas time, he handed in his resignation, and at the first meeting of the department of early March, Professor Aline announced that this job was vacant. And he had in mind the guy who was in the Caribbean in a government job, whom he thought would take up this post, and he would recommend him. Well, I kept quiet at the meeting, but next morning I went and met Sir George, and I said, "Champ," he was known to us all as Champ, I said, "Champ, our situation in Jamaica is untenable. My wife simply cannot continue to function as a junior doctor forever, and life is exceedingly difficult. Let me go back to Barbados in this post and really start some serious work in Barbados." Well, Sir George, who had planned my fellowship, achieved my Wellcome Trust financing, and planned for development of clinical pharmacology in Jamaica, was clearly not pleased with losing one of his mentees. So he folded his arms and he looked at me for 2 minutes in silence. And at the end of the 2 minutes he said, "But Henry, you have research training. You won't be able to use your research training in Barbados. It would be a waste of your training. Don't you see that?" Now, I was only the 3rd medical graduate of the UWI in its 20-odd years to do a PhD as well as a medical degree. I was only the 3rd person trained formally in research skills and techniques. I knew that that PhD had to be done because I had to have the skills that were needed to guide other people in doing good research, good, credible research, how to write a grant, how to undertake the whole process. So I said to Champ, "Well, that's a challenge. We will see. I will do research in Barbados and I'll get other people doing research, but I have to apply for that job. And I am begging you to make it happen that I can go home to Barbados and you will see the growth in Barbados." And so he finally gave in, he relented, and he recommended me for the transfer. And so 7 months after arrival in Jamaica, to the date, the 18th of September, 7 months later, we arrived in Barbados. Maureen, me, and little Rob, who by this time was just over a year old. Now, I told you about the dengue epidemic. One of the amusing, ironic things in life is that there was I treating all these dengue patients in Jamaica, dengue everywhere. I arrived in Barbados on the 18th of September, and on the 20th of September, my mother came down with a fever. And it was classical dengue. All the headache, the eye pain, the back pain, everything. So I took her blood samples, and I said, "You have dengue." And a week later, I took the next blood sample. We sent it off to Trinidad, where the CAREC lab was doing the tests, and they confirmed that my mother had a dramatic dengue titer rise. So she had dengue, and she was the first recorded, documented case of dengue in Barbados in that epidemic. So I could be blamed for bringing a mosquito with dengue in my pocket and giving it to my mother the night that we arrived at her house. So, you know, it's amazing how often you make history in small, insignificant ways, but in fascinating ways, that I studied Endgame in Jamaica and I give it to my mother. Anyway, we arrived in Barbados. So this was now our opportunity to do all the things that we really wanted to do in life in Barbados. We learned the skills, we had the London experience and training, we had the further experience in Jamaica. We knew how to adapt to a very difficult situation in Jamaica. We saw the political challenges, and then our removal to Barbados was so serendipitous that that post had been created that I could then come to Barbados, which is where my navel string is buried, where my wife also was born, and where we could then make a major contribution to Barbados, but also to the University of the West Indies. So I came into the post of lecturer in medicine, and my wife came into a private practice situation, and I can go into that because there are lots of good stories that relate to that. And she also was for a few years an associate lecturer where she was teaching dermatology to the medical students. So again, she made history because she was the first dermatologist in Barbados, and she was the first teacher of dermatology in Barbados. But Jamaica was a tremendous experience, and I'll end my Jamaican phase with one comment. Michael Manley, in his desire to please people, and in his desire to provide an opportunity for employment of people who had never been employed, and in his desire to nationalize the extremely profitable bauxite industry, created major problems that really had ripple effects in the Jamaican society for a long time, because he talked about nationalization of the bauxite companies for his entire first period in office, 1972 to 1976. By the time he created the legislation for it to happen, the bauxite companies had stockpiled their bauxite. So the income that Jamaica derived after that was very limited. And he himself, in turn, in his desire to provide employment for the unemployable and the unemployed, he provided jobs cleaning Kingston up. So when we arrived in Jamaica in January of 1977, one of the striking things were street cleaners everywhere. People sweeping streets, people weeding streets, people cleaning the city. And the city never looked cleaner than in that first 6 months of 1977, when all of the people who had never worked were given jobs. It was like, I don't know whether it started, I don't know when it started. It may have been a pre-election gimmick that just went on, but millions of dollars were spent in the street cleaning. And by the time we went back to Jamaica, the economic crunch had begun in a very, very serious way. When the Jamaican dollar was introduced soon after independence, it was set at $1.20 US. So it was set at a value higher than the American dollar. When we were in Britain, checking on the Jamaican news, we would see the periodic reduction in the value of the Jamaican dollar. And by the time we went back to Jamaica in 1977, the Jamaican dollar was way down, far less than the US dollar. And that decline continued steadily all the way through the years until it's now a mere fraction, less than 100th of the US dollar. So it shows the problems that happen when a country spends beyond its means as a result of the fact that it was so underdeveloped. Jamaica, you may recall, thought that they were very wealthy because of the bauxite industry, the big agricultural industry, the sugar industry, the banana industry, and the tourist industry, which had blossomed. So that by the time 1962 came, and that Jamaican election, which Mr. Bustamante won, Sir Alexander Bustamante won it on the strength of what has been said by George Bell in his discussion of the Republic. George Bell talks about Sir Alexander talking about the big pig giving suck to the little pigs of the Eastern Caribbean. And the Jamaican election was won on the thesis Bustamante put forward that Jamaica, being wealthy and big, was going to be expected to support the poor little Caribbean islands, you see. So it was a typical example of a political misrepresentation of facts, but with a grain of truth because of their profitable bauxite and tourist industries. And of course the bauxite industry, in a sense, went through the Edos, so did the sugarcane industry, so did many things, and they simply could not salvage their economy by the time we went home in 1977. And I say home because I have to say Jamaica was my second home. And when I had graduated, I had assumed that my academic career would be spent in Jamaica, since there was no medical teaching of any significance in Barbados, a very underdeveloped medical community, a hospital that was new but had little staff. I had always assumed that my academic career would be in Jamaica, doing research and teaching there. That was not going to be the case, and I'm very proud of what we were able to achieve in Barbados subsequently. I always feel that if one door closes, then another opens, or possibly a window through which you can then jump. And the Jamaican door, when Maureen and I went home to Jamaica, was very definitely closed because it could not work. There was no decent job for Maureen, and Jamaica was in crisis. So the opportunity turned up for coming home to Barbados, and we came with alacrity. It was a wonderful opportunity. I've always, been inspired by Sir Walter Scott's famous poem, "Breathes there a man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, 'This is my own, my native land, from wandering on a foreign strand.'" And that's how we felt about coming home. So it was exciting. It was an opportunity. Rob was a very young child. We had to settle in, fit in, find our feet in Barbados after having worked in Jamaica and made the bridge of that gap from being a junior doctor to a senior doctor managing a team. And this was one of the interesting things about Barbados, because when I came home, to be frank, following independence, Barbados had changed. And so here was I joining the staff at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital as a university lecturer, the very month after the famous and notorious Sir Jack Leacock, the powerhouse of the hospital, had retired. Now, I happened to be almost as tall as Sir Jack, almost as bald as Sir Jack, but maybe 30 years younger. And Sir Jack had been such a powerhouse that when I came as a young upstart at the hospital with all kinds of ideas of how to modernize our medical services in a hospital that had been planned in the era of 1960, opened in 1964, and this was 1977, many years later, and we were still operating as a hospital in the 1960s era, but with personnel who were very much post-independence. And here was I as a young white upstart, and all of my initial ideas were met by many of the people in the hospital with, "Who he think he is? He think he's Mr. Leacock? We're going to show him." So I had that kind of challenge as a young man, trying to make changes in a hospital that was basically in the status quo. And that was a very major problem, because when I arrived, I was an internist, that's a physician specialist, with specialty training in pharmacology and hypertension and to some extent neurology. And at the time, the Department of Medicine at the hospital only had a cardiologist, now Professor Sir Trevor Hassel, and a general physician, Dr. Jordan, with an interest in diabetes. And I was the third physician. So we had a major challenge. My wife came in as a dermatologist, a part-timer, associate lecturer in dermatology, but none of the other specialties were there. And fortunately, I had had significant training in neurology, in rheumatology, some in geriatrics and metabolic medicine, and in gastroenterology as well. And so I was able to fill in for all of those specialties and attempt to modernize those specialties, which created a bit of a problem with the extent that I wanted to change things. I was in a sense, a nuisance in the administration because I wanted so many things. I wanted so many modern tests to be done that could not be done. For example, my wife. My wife was a very, very well-trained dermatologist, spending 4 years, graduated at the Institute of Dermatology with this distinction, experience in their hospital there, working in dermatopathology with a particular research and pathological experience that was very, very valuable in certain diseases. And we found that it was simply impossible for her to do any of that in the hospital lab. And most of the tests that I was accustomed to at Hammersmith Hospital were simply not available because the facilities had been set up in the 60s and the hospital had operated under a government premise now in the 70s that primary care was important. So they were talking about primary care without doing very much, but they were not spending any money in the hospital. And it was very interesting that after a couple of years, my research grant was not renewed because I couldn't get the work done fast enough to get it renewed by the British entity Wellcome Trust. And so I wrote an application for a technologist and submitted it to the Ministry of Health. And Dr. Harney, who was the Chief Medical Officer, she gave me some excellent advice. She said, we've never had a proposal like this. She said, the hospital has had no new staff in more than 15 years. So if you want to get this proposal through, you've got to make it more than 1 page so that it looks serious, but not more than 2 pages, because nobody in government will read anything that is more than 2 pages. And that, I thought, was wonderful management advice, which I utilized to good effect in a number of other situations. But I wrote up my proposal for the funding of a technologist. And it was very funny because it went through the government. It was approved by the Chief Medical Officer and the Permanent Secretary. It went to the Public Service Commission, and believe it or not, it was approved. And the Assistant Hospital Director came to me with a notice that it had been approved. And she said, Henry, how on earth did you get this done? Are you related to Mr. Adams? This was the perception in Barbados, that you could only get something done if you had a very close nepotistic connection with the authorities. So that was a valuable lesson that I learned with success. I wasn't always as successful, I have to tell you, in many other areas. Domestically, we had to look around for a house and a place to live, and we were very fortunate because after looking at a number of places that were very strange, people built some very, very strange houses in Barbados. We looked at a house that had a coconut tree growing up through the living room, through a hole in the roof. And we wondered, well, you know, when it rains, what on earth happens? Then we looked at another house that had absolutely no garden, but a magnificent view. And then we found this place at Upton, which Maureen fell in love with, because it had recently been renewed. It had been full of termites, the old house, and it had been rebuilt from the foundations up. So in 1977, it looked smart, and it had a lovely kitchen, which Maureen loved, and it had a garden, which I loved, because I'm a plants man. I was brought up in the country, in rural St. John, and I just fell in love with the garden and the trees, and I saw the potential, because trees are magnificent, and we have great trees, all the spiritual trees in the world in my garden. So we enjoyed it very much, and Rob enjoyed it, because Rob grew up here as a little boy, and we got dogs. You need dogs for security in Barbados, but we got dogs which he absolutely loved. One of them he called Shadow, because it was his shadow. It followed him everywhere he went. And because we had a yard and a place to play and a table tennis board, as Rob was growing up, this was the center for all of his friends, and there were always 7 kids around here living at Upton virtually during the vacation, which was wonderful because we knew they were out of trouble and we could keep half of an eye on them. So these were the good things about our move to Barbados. One of the bad things was the terrible trauma we had because of Maureen's father's illness. He had problems of diabetes and hypertension, and he had an operation which was a disaster, and things went from bad to worse, and he suffered 6 months of torture. And he was the most revered Mason in Barbados. He knew everything about the Masonic lodges. He was the great guru that everyone went to for advice on ritual and how to take actions and how to really run a Masonic lodge. He was the most revered man, as well as being the headmaster of Foundation School. So when he died, it was devastating for us, and it took us a year or two to really recover from the trauma of that event. On the other hand, my own parents, who were equally elderly and equally infirm, being able to look after them in their own home was a great boon. And I've always said that looking after elderly people is a privilege, and should be a privilege that's enjoyed and undertaken by most kids when they grow up, because the older person doesn't want to be removed from the home that they've built up or that they know and that they're familiar with, and moving them into a care home really disjoints them very much and is very sad for them. And Maureen and I, working as a team, we were tremendously satisfied to be able to care for my parents, you know, and my wife was very good at handling the neuroses of my mother and my father, just as I was good at handling issues with her mother when she came to live with us. So that's one of the things that I'd like to say, to promote the concept of older people being looked after by their family. And when it's not possible, when a home just doesn't have enough room for an old person who needs help, sometimes the best way of dealing with that is having a daycare center. Now, I've been pushing this for 40 years in Barbados. The daycare center at St. Barnabas Church is a role model, and I've tried to get other churches to do the same thing. Because if an elderly person needs help, needs care, needs help with bathing, with eating, with looking after themselves, maybe their hair, then all that the person who is working has to do for mommy or daddy is to take them to the daycare center in the morning on the way to work, pick them up in the afternoon, and bring them back to their home, whether it's the home of the child or their own home. And that 10 hours or so during the day at the daycare center would solve half of the problems that the elderly have in Barbados. So those are some of the thoughts about our early days back in Barbados.
And we'll continue to hear more about Sir Henry's life and exploits in Barbados in the next program. Until then, I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care, and thanks for your time.